everyone. Welcome to the Wheel of Mind, a character point of view reread podcast dedicated to Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time series. This season, we're taking a deep dive into Moiraine's POV. I'm Lajara Dane of the White Ajah.
And I'm Giskel Semaris, a scholar from Ilion. We want to give a quick reminder to our new listeners. This is a reread podcast, so we'll potentially spoil anything from any of the 15 books. That being said, today we're here to discuss chapters 4 and 5 from New Spring. Lajara, can you start us off with your synopsis of chapter 4?
Sure. Thanks, Giskel. Chapter 4 is called Leaving the Tower. It picks up right after the assembly in the lecture hall in chapter 3, in which Tamra initiates the search for the Dragon Reborn under the guise of just providing gold to anyone who's given birth in the last few days. So as soon as they leave the lecture hall, Moiraine and Siuan head to their respective rooms to pack for their trip, departure immediately. Tamra said that they would be equipped with everything they need to do the job, but Moiraine, being Moiraine, just doesn't even trust the Amyrlin seat to pack for her, so she begins to overpack meticulously. She gets her boots. She thinks about putting on some extra layers because it's cold, but decides she doesn't have any time. But, she assumes they're going to be indoors while taking down names. After all, these people will respect those they take for Aes Sedai, right? She packs a dagger because the Amyrlin made it clear that they can't use the power in self-defense. But that ends up proving useless because they're always surrounded by a ring of guards. She puts a hairbrush, a comb, fancy gloves, 2 extra pairs of socks, not just one, a sewing kit, twine, and a knife for trimming quills in case they're going to have to be writing with those. Siuan's already been waiting for her by the time she gets out in the hallway. She's been there for a hot minute. So they head to the stable where Moiraine has her own horse that she bought herself as a present when she got the ring after passing her accepted test. She wishes she got one for Siuan too, who is terrified of horses and is a terrible rider. It's barely allowed for her to have her own mount as an accepted, and she's actually already gotten in trouble for taking Arrow out jumping fences and stuff. And the stable woman makes fun of her as she checks the saddlebags instead of just hopping onto the horse and leaving. The stable woman's just standing there with the reins trying to hand them to her, and Moiraine's rummaging through the saddlebags trying to see what they already have packed for her. So there's already food packed there. There's real pens, so she doesn't even need that knife to trim the quills. There's a lap desk, and there's a jar of ink, and she absolutely has to check that the ink is firmly closed before she even takes the reins and thinks about getting on the horse, which is another thing the stable woman's making fun of her for. They end up meeting the leader of their escort, a grizzled older man named Stellar. Siuan already starts trying to boss this guy about what they need to do, and I think I remember the Amyrlin last chapter explicitly saying, you need to mind your guards. But he's already gotten his orders about where they're going to go. He doesn't need her telling them what to do. And his orders include taking these accepted back to the tower if they make a fuss, which you're not making a fuss, are you? They leave through the southernmost western gate, and this disappoints Moiraine because it's not likely to take them towards Dragonmount. We learn during this time that Siuan is pretty good at puzzles, and we think that maybe she's treating their guard Stellar like a puzzle. She's trying to figure out how she can get him to take them nearer to Dragonmount, so she tries several times throughout the chapter. Then as they ride throughout the city, Moiraine describes the people and the scenery in her thoughts. She explains all the differences in clothing and appearance and behavior of all the ethnicities in this melting pot of Tar Valon. And she's pretty judgmental about it. I'll get into that a little more later. The scenery is cool. I don't remember getting this much detail about Ogier masonry anywhere else in the series. We hear that it's pretty and intricate, but this has some beautiful examples. When you let the Ogier just be creative and carve what they want to, you get buildings that look like flock of birds taking flight, schools of fish swimming around. There's a notable inn that's a giant blue cat. Moiraine bows to an Ogier foreman that she sees. There's some there doing repair work. Siuan, in her focus on Stellar, doesn't even seem to see an Ogier in front of them. When they get to the edge of the city, Moiraine feels weird crossing the bridge because even setting foot on it is just about the worst thing you can do as a novice or accepted. It's pretty much just short of murder. It's considered an attempt to run away. White cloaks are silently blocking the bridge further ahead. And this time, Moiraine is the one who gets bossy to Stellar. She's like, these White Cloaks need to respect us and to get out of the way. And she even considers sort of whacking Stellar on the head a little bit with the power to get him to make the White Cloaks move, but Siwan stops her. The White Cloaks turn around and head back into the village at the foot of the bridge, and the party heads on. Moiraine is disappointed that none of the extra crap that she has packed has been useful yet. Typical overpacker. I know that this happens to me a lot. Siwan tries to boss Stellar in the direction of Dragonmount again, but it ain't happening. Just as Moiraine did about 2 friggin' seconds ago, Siwan also embraces the power to try to boss the soldier around, and Moiraine discourages her. They ride through the abandoned village of Alandair. It's abandoned because the people went inside the walls of Tar Valon when the fighting became imminent. And historically, this village has been burned several times, so they knew they were probably a target. Moraine's glad to get out of the village because it's really dismal and it smells like smoke. They get to the first camp of soldiers and camp followers, and there's already 2 accepted posted up there taking names in a tent. Moiraine, as per usual so far, is judgmental about these 2 in her thoughts, really describing a lot about their appearance and their attitudes, and Siwan seems to agree with her. These 2 are very nearly reading each other's minds throughout the whole chapter. They get to the next camp of Mirandians where they're going to set up for their job. Moiraine continues to be judgmental about Mirandians. She's disgusted by their accents and their supposedly quarrelsome nature. But the men in the camp are polite to them. She seems pleasantly surprised by this, that the men come in and bring some braziers to keep them warm and a little bit of furniture for their work outdoors. And for some reason, she thinks this might not be too unpleasant after all. And that's where the chapter ends, which is a nice ironic statement that we know is probably going to be contradicted right away.
Yeah, this was, to me, a beautiful chapter. The ride through Tar Valon. Just seeing the scene, rather than having to take us on a tour of all the lands, so they bring all the lands to the city. The author does, and you get to see the differences. And you have people with veils, people without, the different ways of dress, those that swagger and those that don't, and how some of that is generalized through the different countries. The different cultures of those people, but yeah, just a way of bringing the entire world there to Tar Valon rather than taking our characters on a tour of the entire world. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, I don't think Tar Valon is ever quite this richly described in the main series, even though our Wonder Girls go there for a little while. I just recently read in The Great Hunt where the girls get off of the ship at Tar Valon, but they barely have time to kind of talk about the towers and bridges, and then they get whisked away by Shiriam, and they immediately spend all their time in the tower, and then they're whisked off to the rest of the world for the rest of the series and don't spend much time. We don't see much of Tar Valon, the city, and what a colorful, interesting place it is.
Even the mention of the bridges and different things in the other books, they don't mention the size and the scope of them. This one, the bridge they take is a mile long, which was built with the one power. It's something that really in many ways exceeds even the Ogier stonework, which, as you said, was so beautifully described. To me, it puts the entire city in an entirely different scope of understanding. It's much bigger and grander than I saw from reading the main body of work.
Yeah, I was just imagining, really, before looking at this description again, I've still had in my head just white stone everywhere and maybe some pretty, intricately carved little statues and friezes and stuff on the outside, but this is a whole other level. I can't wait to see, if the show becomes a big deal, the explosion of fan art that could come from it. Even the show's depiction of things, I'm not sure how that's going to go, but it's very difficult to depict fantasy architecture like this and do it well.
Yes.
Amazon is throwing a lot of money at this project, so I hope that they have the means to do it. But I just think even if we don't get to see what we want on the screen, the fact that the fandom might grow from it in the way that the Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire fandom did, we could see this explosion of many more artists joining the fandom and representing it in a lot of cool different ways.
Right. And another thought I had when reading this and studying it was that in the world that Robert Jordan has built here in the Wheel of Time, religion does not play a very big part in it.
Mm-hmm.
They have religious beliefs, of course, the belief in reincarnation. And even though Robert Jordan himself was a very religious man, he didn't design many of his characters that way.
Mm-hmm.
But in essence, Tar Valon is almost the Vatican
Yeah.
of their world, because here it's not so much a religious power as this the magical power that's gathered and kept and stored, and people are trained, and Tar Valon is the center of that. And because that, you see the richness of the city that is all based upon the White Tower. I mean, of course, there's a lot of commerce, there's a lot of things that go on, but the White Tower being there makes this a central focus of all the lands in many ways. And so you have, again, the entire world gathered there. You have the beautiful architecture, its history going back thousands of years, at a time when the one power was wielded in different ways that have been lost to them.
Mm-hmm.
And here you kind of get glimpses of that. It's just in the architecture, and this is a very beautiful thing to me.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the interesting way that he kind of replaces religion somewhat, like religious organization. I mean, he does have those aspects of belief that many people seem to share across the series, but the fact that there's not like people gathering for worship anywhere that we ever really see. I never really thought of Tar Valon as the replacement for that.
With the exception of the White Cloaks,
Yeah, they do have a text. They're the only
yeah,
people who seem to do that.
yes, but with that exception, and again, they're from people of every country, of every
Yeah.
nation. But yeah, with that exception, the Tar Valon and the one power, as wielded by the Aes Sedai, is the replacement for that in my
Yeah.
mind. There are a lot of subtle things here that the rooms of all the accepteds are pretty much the same, but he still is able to bring in the slight differences between Moiraine's and Siuan's,
Mm-hmm.
which again, their status in life before coming to the White Tower, I believe, is just total reflection of that. That Moiraine is, of course, from royalty. She's a very rich woman and comes from a rich family. The Damodreds are powerful, influential. We'll get into that a little more later in the podcast. But
Mm-hmm.
Siuan coming up with nothing, and you're able to see that just in their rooms, the slight differences in it, even though both of them are, they have almost nothing. When they're packing things, Siuan is ready so much faster because she doesn't have a lot of earthly belongings.
Yeah.
Basically, all she has is what's been given to her by the tower and the clothes she wore when she arrived there, and it's pretty much the sum total of her, personal belongings.
Mm-hmm.
Here you see Moiraine, even though she's not able to use these things most of the time here on this outing, which is something that is just unheard of for acceptance to be able to leave the city for any reason.
Yeah.
Here, or even the tower for the most part, she is. She has some things set aside. She has some things ready. She can overpack with and overprepare. But that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I love about delving into her mind. Not just her tenacity and her strength, but her willingness to prepare, to look ahead, to see what she might need. She's the Eagle Scout of the Sedai here, that always being
Yeah.
prepared in every way that she can be.
You did a great job of, I think, finding all the seeds of her character in this chapter that we see really grow into very strong and stable and admirable character traits later. Now we do see that her ability to plan gets messed up by our Taviran characters and that their
Yes.
effect on the pattern, but um, she always has these plans upon backup plans, it seems like. And I think I've been noticing more in this chapter the things that annoy me about being in her head, because it seems so different from the more mature Moiraine that we find later in the series.
Yes. Yeah. There's some pettiness there.
Yeah, so that brings me perfectly to my next point, which is, I mean, parts of it was funny. Like, I liked the overpacking stuff, but I do take your point that that's indicative of how careful she is throughout the rest of the series and how careful she needs to be. She gets the fact that she's undertaking really important jobs. But it's funny. I mean, did she really think the Amerlin would just send them out without, all the stuff they would need to do their jobs? The 2 extra pairs of socks really got me. Like, I get one might get wet, but you needed to take 2. But it's funny. She's also kind of impulsive with using the power, and Siuan is too.
Right.
This also shows their relative immaturity at this point in the series, and I think also highlights the addictive power of saidar.
Right.
So that's why it's so easy for them to be so impulsive with it, even though they've been studying, working with the power for years now. They're still like, oh, I wish I could use it to make this guard do what I want.
Right.
That's kind of their first go-to, is to try to think of using the power to solve problems. But there were some other things that I found a little more annoying about her. She seems really judgmental in her own thoughts. She uses a lot of stereotypes when she's describing the different nationalities. To some degree, some of them are just like, oh, there's the ones with the veils and the mustaches. But
Right.
sometimes she's like, I mean, come on, Maureen, that Saldean man's eye shape has nothing to do with whether or not he's like sleazy and ogling you. The way she
Right.
worded it, like a tilt-eyed Saldean was ogling us, and
Yes.
yeah,
Trying to pull her skirts down over, below her knees because
yeah,
he can see her leg below the knees, and
right. And we
he
see
looked a
that,
little too long. Yes.
yeah, yeah, we see that Kyrian in propriety. She's extreme, like they're the most modest culture I think we see in the
Yes.
series, probably.
Yes,
Um,
and it comes into play more again the next chapter as well. But you're right; I
mhm,
didn't even catch that of it being an almost racist or nationalist point of view,
mhm.
but it very much was. In my mind, I just imagined the man truly ogling her. But you're
Yeah,
right; it
and he
probably
might have
was
been, but the fact that
suppressed.
she said it with that physical description of his ethnicity, I was like, oh, that's, mm, I don't
Right.
know.
I did not even catch that reading through it, but it's very prominent now that you pointed it out.
And I thought her description of the Andorans were similarly biased, but also kind of funny because we see the entire rest of the series through Andoran people's eyes for the most part. So she's like, oh, those Andorans were so stubborn and they're wearing super bland clothes and they're unimaginative people.
Yeah.
And again, stereotyping this whole people by just a few she sees walking in the crowd and attributing, she doesn't know about their imagination. They just look like they're walking with purpose, and she kind of extrapolates all this stuff. And she has this Goldilocks way of like what she prefers with people's clothes. So they're either too bland, like the Andorans she saw, or they're too flamboyant, like Elida's dress. I think in your chapter she compares to tinker clothes, which everybody
Yes.
uses as their standard of just like, oh, it makes you want to vomit. It's so garish.
Yes.
So it's really interesting to see these little character flaws because it's apparent that she's grown out of this stuff by the time we see her in the eye of the world. It's another mark of accepted Moiraine's immaturity compared to the fully grown Aes Sedai of 20 years plus Moiraine that we meet later.
Right. Yes.
So yeah, I thought that was a little interesting, and then I had a few points about her and Siwan's friendship. Mostly, it was cool seeing how they keep each other in check. They both have a little bit of this impulsiveness with the way they want to use the power, but the other one will help hold her back.
Right.
And they do have their differences that we see too, though. So Moiraine seems a little judgmental of people's behavior and stuff. But then, then again, we don't see Siwan's thoughts in this chapter, but it just seems like Siwan, I mean, the way Moiraine described her in previous chapters was that she used to have very rough language, just redolent with the docks. And, Siwan's used to tying up her skirts really high to work on boats. And so I imagine that Siwan's not looking at people through the same lens that Moiraine is. So I just see Moiraine paying way too much attention to people, and I get why she's reading too much into their culture with these stereotypes and stuff and how she thinks they should be acting, because that seems very Game of Houses, which is a Kyrian and nobility thing, where they're
Yes.
always trying to figure out what people are trying to signal with their subtle behaviors. So when people are too direct, they're kind of improper to her.
Yes. Yes.
And so I'm just guessing Siwan, as direct as she is not thinking of all these people in Tar Valon this way. And then Moiraine is also a little more pessimistic about their possible separation in the future, and she thought about this in the last chapter too. She thinks about their possible separation after they attain the Shawl. In this context, she's thinking not so much about one of them traveling and one of them being Amyrlin, as it does end up. She's thinking about their Ajah choice. They actually do both end up going blue, but at this point in the story, Moiraine is thinking she herself is probably going to go blue, but Siwan seems a little too interested in men for according to her
Yeah.
standards and might go green.
Exactly. Yeah, that was her thoughts as the green Ajah, and I thought that was odd because you think they would have discussed this before. Although there's many things within the tower that are taboo, many subjects that are taboo. Maybe the Accepted have already picked up on that.
Hmm.
That we don't discuss that ahead of time or something. But you'd think, as close as these two are, that would have been a point of discussion before now. Or perhaps neither of them really know that this is just the way they're leaning to that point
Yeah.
forward. But
Yeah, it
yeah,
might
I thought
be
that was
that,
interesting as well too.
yeah, Swan could be sort of flirting with both in the times that they've talked about it, but I'm not sure.
Right.
It's not clear, like you said, whether they have talked about it or what they have said when they've talked about it before.
Right. Because this, of course, being written from Moraine's point of view, is all of this is taking place inside her head.
Mm-hmm.
And she's one of those people who she is projecting what she thinks people are thinking
Mm-hmm.
in quite a lot of this. And so their reactions are not just what they do or what they say, but what she thinks they mean by that.
Yeah.
It is subtle, and until we discussed a lot of this, it didn't occur to me. She's used to projecting and imagining and trying to just estimate what someone's going to do and guess their motives and what actions they're going to take.
Yeah. I think we see she's she gets more refined at it perhaps as she goes along. This time she's reading a lot into things. So then her thinking about how they're going to get separated makes me sad. It did in the last chapter too, because they don't get to interact much in the main series. They can't be as intimate anymore as they are in these books. I think Moiraine, I think it's in Great Hunt chapters 7 and 8 when Moiraine sees her in Fal Dara. Moiraine had sent Siwan only 2 letters in the 20 years they'd been separated, is what Siwan says at the beginning of the Great Hunt. And Moiraine thinks in her thoughts she's holding secrets back from her friend the next time that they do meet up there in Fal Dara. And that's when she is presenting Rand to her as the Dragon Reborn. But I think she's holding back the fact that she knows the Forsaken are becoming unbound. She doesn't even tell her that part of
Right.
their adventure. So it's sad that she's having to hold important parts of their shared mission when they started this journey together. They both end up hearing terrible news about each other throughout the series, and they don't get a chance to meet up after that. Moiraine hears about the White Tower coup, when Siwan gets deposed and stilled, and the news is at the time that she was also killed, I think.
Yes.
And Moiraine has to keep her cool about that and not react in front of the other people when she hears it. I don't remember who she's with at the time, but I do remember that we don't really get to see her react. And you don't realize what a big impact that's probably having on her until you see how close they are in New Spring.
Right.
And we see on the other side, too, that Siwan hears of Moiraine's apparent death when she goes through the doorway, and we don't get to see Siwan have time to react to that either. And that's kind of like a common thing throughout the series is nobody gets time to process their trauma. They're always having to move on to the next big thing.
Right.
And then we never get a reunion after Moiraine returns from the Tower of Genji that I remember. If we did, it was very lackluster. So, yeah, kind of
You're
tragic.
right. You kind of caught me silent there because I could not recall. I was processing that, trying to recall, and I don't remember one either.
If they did, it was not the poignant scene that I would want it to be because it didn't stand out.
Right. Right. And here at this point in New Spring, with a couple of times seeing Moiraine think about or feel concern for the possibility they may be separated, makes me believe she probably grew up a very lonely person.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
sheltered, not a lot of close friends.
She's used to that kind of rejection or separation, maybe.
Yeah, and fears it because she's never had a friend this close. I imagine. Again, I'm
Yeah.
reading into this what the author didn't explicitly say, but that's what I get from her personality. That she's probably never had a friend this close. This is something she doesn't want to lose, but
Yeah.
she knows she will.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. It could be a fear of abandonment. Isn't she? Her mother died when she was a young child, right?
Yes.
So that would make sense that someone who had lost a parent early in life would be afraid that people they get close to are going to leave.
Right.
Wow. Oh, that's huge. I never thought about it like that, but I can totally see that. Do you have any other thoughts about this chapter?
Just again, kind of an admiration for the author, the way this is written.
Mm-hmm.
The incident with the white cloaks. He doesn't have to launch into a description of the animosity between the White Cloaks that they have for the Aes Sedai. I don't know that that's reciprocated. The Aes Sedai more appear to want to just avoid them because of the misunderstandings. The White Cloaks thinking they're witches, they're evil, that they need to be done away with. And the Aes Sedai know that for the most part, at least, they are good and they are dedicated for the good. Of course, the existence of the Black Ajah is not really known or pointed out at this point. But just that incident at the bridge, they get to the apex. They can look about a half mile ahead to the foot of the bridge. There's the White Cloaks. You never see any interaction, but he doesn't have to describe there's animosity. You feel it just in seeing that. And then the way that there's a little bit of tension there, and then the White Cloaks just move on. No words are expressed because the distance is too great. No confrontation is really there, so much as just a subtle bullying, I guess, or a reminder that we're here and we're watching you, and that's the extent of it. But I just have an admiration for whether the author can bring out things that there's a history behind it, but he doesn't have to describe the history. He doesn't have to be blatant about it. The subtlety there is it lends so much more realism to everything in this story, and I love his ability to do that.
Yeah, while we're on writing notes, you're right. He does convey that subtlety really well. And I think at the point in the series or point in the timeline when this book was published, he was zooming in a lot on subtleties, more so than being focused on a bigger view of the plot.
Yes.
So this one being in the middle of what many people consider the slog of the series, when things really slow down. You can even see that in how much time has passed so far. So we have now finished chapter 4. The trumpets only just stopped, and they started towards the end of chapter 1. So there's only been, because chapters 1 and 2 were kind of happening partially at the same time. This is all taking place in the same day. The girls were with the Amyrlin for 4 hours. It was around dawn when their shift ended, when Katara died. Then they go and have breakfast, or didn't skip breakfast actually, and then test Moiraine a little bit, and then they have the lecture hall quest given to them, and then they go out, and it's like noon, I think, by the time they're crossing the bridge. So it shows you this is the point when Robert Jordan is really slowing down as far as the time that's passing, and also focusing in on fleshing out a lot of world building, which he already did throughout the series, but here's where you see that stretched out so much.
Right. Well, in essence, the entire existence of the book New Spring is to flesh out what is already there. It doesn't advance the story really to any degree, but it is just bringing backstory and realism and a human element to people like Moiraine, who, especially in the eye of the world, is just almost inhuman in her strength of will, her treatment of people. There's such a superiority there, but of course we know later she's part of this is an act. Part of it is just her confidence in her power, but yeah, making her more human, and many of the other characters in here, of course, Lan Mandorgan as well. This New Spring is a beautiful novel, but it was not to advance the main story. It was to fill out and flesh out the main story.
Right. You could tell he was just sort of in that mood. He's like, I don't know if I'm in the place to advance a bunch of big plot points, so let me take some more time to keep fleshing out this world and characters.
I've got to let my readers know these people like I do. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I like that. Yeah, so that's all I've got on this chapter. If you're cool with that, we can move on to you giving your summary of chapter 5.
Very good. Chapter 5 is a little longer chapter. It's entitled The Human Heart. It begins with them in the Mirandian camp. Just the work becomes a slog of monotony. Here they're taking down names, and it's surprising how many women are there with children born within or close to the time range that's given. So they're taking down the names, or of course no money is actually being passed at this point in time. It's a promise. We see one incident where a child is obviously too old, but though the child is well fed, the mother is on the brink of starvation. We get a little backstory. Her husband was killed before the fighting started, and she's just not been taken care of. Here we also see Moiraine, of course, being from royalty. She's upset that the person's liege lord has not taken care of this woman. Obviously, there's been no pay or anything. There's been nothing considered even for those people who are not directly in the fighting. And she brings forth her perspective that a liege is supposed to take care of his people. It has greater responsibility than they do. So she goes ahead and takes this woman's name, actually hands her some money, I think a silver piece, to go to the wise woman to get some help for the child who may be a little sick. And then, of course, that opens the door for every other woman in the camp who has a child that's too old, who jumps in because of greed, and she has to dial that back. She has to put them in their place. You see Moiraine's temper in this, how she has to assert authority that she's able to do, but in a way almost uncomfortable with it. Before they're finished taking names, we meet two more Aes Sedai who travel through the camp. We meet Myelin, who's a green, and Elada, who's a red. We're not really given what their mission is, but they're already aware of what the girls are up to. Siuan has to quench her desire to make up excuses. Well, although it's a real excuse, they have a real reason for being out there, but she feared being in trouble with these two, especially, I believe, Elada. We get a little more of the backstory between these two. It's already been mentioned in the previous chapter, but Elada was one who rose very quickly in the ranks. She's a woman of great ability and a woman of great ambition, great power within the Sadar. The girls feel apprehensive just being in her presence. There's a little dialogue that goes back and forth, and then the girls have to finish very quickly because they don't have time. Stellar is pushing them to leave right now. We must leave right now. The women in the Mirandian camp step in. They intercede so that Siuan and Moiraine can finish this quickly, get all the names done, and they're able to finish, and then they have to make time going back home to the White Tower. They were still the last group to arrive, but they arrived before they would receive punishments. But they no more than get to their rooms when one of the other accepted tells Moiraine that she has to go meet with Miriam, who is the keeper of novices. She has to deliver what she thought would be heartbreaking news, that King Laman and his brothers Morrison and Eldacane have been killed. These are Moiraine's uncles. Now, surprisingly, Moiraine doesn't show a lot of remorse at this. That is not heartbroken at the news. Though Miriam tells her, you can take off from tomorrow's duties, Moiraine, in her mind, again, just showing her judgmentalism, doesn't like her uncles. They were very grasping, ambitious people. She was not close to them. Evidently, they had treated her father poorly. So she really had no love lost for them. She convinces Miriam that she would be better off working, that they would take her mind off of it. She goes to her room, skips supper, even though she's ravenously hungry, to pray for their souls. But she considers this a penance, not for any other reason except for her judgmentalism of them. She's aware that she judges them harshly, that was probably a poor thing to do, even though they, sounds like, deserved it. She shouldn't have thought of the dead that way. So she in penance, skips supper, prays for their souls, has her going on to bed, and then sometime in the night getting up, going to Siuan's room, and they have some dialogue there. They're close friends. They kind of curl up together in bed, and they talk a little bit before the end of the chapter. It's a beautiful chapter. I wondered at first why it was called The Human Heart, but to me, when you see how Moiraine reaches out to help the woman who is starving, how the other Mirandian women, even though they have a penchant for fighting and arguing, how they gathered around to help the other women there to make sure all the names were down. And then as well, just the interaction between the Mistress of Novices and Moiraine and Siuan. All of these show the connection of the human heart between these characters.
I think you're right about that. I didn't really reflect on the title when I read this and the theme there, but we see Moiraine's concern for people more so than her judgmental nature here. I mean, we still see some of that, but we also see her working on it.
Right.
Especially with the news of her uncles.
Right. And surprisingly, the tie-in with all of those characters in the human heart came to me as I was speaking. I had not thought of that ahead of time.
Cool.
It was a sudden inspiration. Some of the things to me that moved this ahead were the small things that happened in the camp. Even the fact that people brought them food. There was one woman who brought them tea, I believe, and others brought them some food. And the one woman at least knew they were not Aes Sedai. Everyone treated them as though they were full Aes Sedai because people don't know much about the towers. She and Siouan talks over lunch about how this lady must have come to the tower at some point, and she at least knows how to look at the hem of a dress and know if someone's accepted or if they're a full sister, and probably can look at the face and tell. We see her taking kind of a pleasure in just seeing the guards that are with them, the bannermen and them just sitting down enjoying a simple lunch. It's like she stops and reflects a moment just on the simple things in life. So again, I kind of get the feeling this is not something she's used to doing. She kind of seizes that moment to just appreciate the simple things in life, a simple lunch, being able to spend time with her best friend here. Of course, they have the excitement of wanting to be the ones to find the Dragon Reborn, a mission that would take her many years. She doesn't know at this point. She hopes to get it wrapped up at the end of the day, I'm sure. Her judgmentalism of people, and yet she kind of stops and takes that breath and just enjoys the moment, enjoys seeing people do what they like doing, watching the children play. We have moments of that in the story that breaks up the monotony of these ladies taking down names. Again, the interplay with the woman who had the young child there, who was obviously too old, but again, you see the humanity, her desire to reach out and trying to do it subtly. Again, news spread, and then she has to take command. In fact, it's kind of funny how she does it. She tells the woman, well, if your child's sick, I can do a healing on him.
Oh, yeah.
She knows, that the accepted are not allowed to do healing spells unless a full Aes Sedai is with them. This is something that could go wrong very easily. So it's something she would have been completely not allowed to do. But again, it's that subtlety of just saying, well, I could do that. The child probably wouldn't survive it. So rather than just telling the woman no, she puts her in a situation where the woman says no. The woman decides to back away because Moiraine was put off by her greediness, just as all of us are. Human nature steps in at times like this, and we see things like that in people because people can be grasping and greedy. Yet again, these are some of the same Mirandian women who stood between the guards and Moiraine and Siouan in a non-threatening way, but stood between them to give them time to put the rest of the names. So we see people can at once be grasping and greedy, and they can be selfless and put themselves between confrontations there, between confrontational people, just in order to make sure everyone has a fair shake at it. And this is pretty good from people who are seen as being very brawling and always in each other's faces. A lot of that's probably just their way of talking, but they're perceived by other people as being, having tempers.
Yeah.
You get to see, and she even mentions here that her temper faded. It never lasted long. That's her thoughts on herself, judging herself. That yes, she got angry, and in fact, she handled it, I believe, in a very good way. But the temper fades very quickly. So that's another glimpse into her demeanor, her personality. Someone who, yes, can have a flash of anger just like anyone, but she deals with it, and then it's gone. She's done, and she's ready to move on to the next thing.
I think it's funny thinking about the fact that she tends to have a temper and then imagining all the times it's got to be flaring up in the eye of the world. And throughout the series as well, but when she's especially first dealing with Matt, you didn't tell me Matt took a freaking dagger from flaming Shatter Logoth. Like, I asked you if he gave you anything or if you touched him, or you didn't tell me this super important thing, and now he's basically Gollum and he's going to infect everyone. You can tell she's angry at that point, but she really keeps it cool. But you know that throughout the series, those boys are just driving her bonkers. And Egwene asking questions that she already answered. She's like, Egwene, I literally just told you things don't have the power. Why did you ask that about my blue stone or my staff? You know how annoying these people must be.
Right. Well, anyone who's dealt with a teenager can empathize with what she was going through at the time, especially when they're not your teenagers. But yeah, just you see that. But evidently she has learned a lot of self-control in
Yeah.
the ensuing 20 years, just as people tend to do.
Yeah.
There was one pull quote that I got from that as well, and how she used fear to control that woman. She didn't give her a command. She just offered a suggestion, and it scared the woman. But then the pull quote is, "But fear is a poor tool, and one that always cuts the user eventually." I thought that was a nice pull quote. I had to write that down and save it in a list of quotes, because it's very true. Fear, people have used it. Parents with children, it always comes back to cut you. Rulers against their subjects. People who try to rule by fear, control by fear. It is a tool that always comes back to cut the user eventually. And I thought that was just very insightful. I love these little quotes, and I've written down different ones throughout reading The Wheel of Time. And it's difficult for me to stop and write a quote, because I'm usually enjoying the story so much. But I've done that a number of times in reading through The Wheel of Time, because there's such great things said. Sometimes a lot of wisdom summed up in a single sentence.
Yeah, I really especially like that. I didn't even notice it. And I listened to this chapter once and read it at least once to prepare. I missed that. I really like it. The language, the wording actually reminds me of the Tuatha Way of the Leaf, because they say that violence hurts the one who does it just as much or more so than the person they do it to. And it reminds me as well of a couple of lines in the Song of Ice and Fire universe, which I know is not really within the scope of this podcast, but George R. R. Martin, I know, liked Robert Jordan's work. They liked each other's work, and they gave nods to each other in their works at times. Martin, in a few places, says that magic is a sword without a hilt, so that it will hurt the wielder as much as what you're using it on, essentially. So he uses that idea that the weapon will also cut you when you use it.
Yes.
Not something that you have that much control over.
Right. Something a lot of people could learn from today, both in the controlling of their temper and in what they use to try to manipulate or even help other people. And then we get into, as I mentioned before, the Aes Sedai that come up. Myelin and Aleida, or Rohan, they, again, both Moiraine and Siuan are very apprehensive around these two. Rightly so. Myelin, even she refers to them as being Aleida's pets. So even she had noticed that Aleida had shown a lot of attention to them. And in Moraine's mind, she thought goats staked out for the lion, but never a pet. Even though she understood that she and Siuan had received a lot of attention from Aleida, it was unwanted attention. It's almost as if Aleida was excited that here are two people who show so much promise, so much power. They are my equals. And so I want to raise them up, in a sense, or help them to be my equal in the White Tower. They would never be her friends, ever. I think she really wanted to seek out the girl's best interest, but at the same time in a way that would promote her interests. Because at this time we've seen, compared to history, the White Tower is very diminished, both in its number of people and in their depth of power. Their ability to do things with the one power is far less than what it used to be, as well as many arts and or ways of using the one power having been lost. Many of the weaves, I think they refer to it as, having been lost over the years. So in every measurable way, they're diminished from what they once historically were. I think Aleida was very proud. Here are two acolytes, whom they're learning fast like me. They're intelligent like me. They have strength and the power like me. And so I want to shape them and mold them to what I want to be. But again, that was unwanted attention, because I don't think she was very nice about it. It's enough all the Aes Sedai noticed and referred to them as her pets. But they were not feeling it. They definitely would never be friends of hers. She may not have wanted friends. Definitely, of course, we know things do not turn out in a friendly fashion, especially between her and Siuan. There's very much an enmity there, or grows into an enmity. But my perspective, and I could be wrong, I think Aleida really wants what's best for them at this point in the story. Again, all of that changes years later.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on it? How did you see that?
Yeah, I had never thought about it like that, because from my memory of this book, and then, seeing a lot of it through the rest of the series, I had thought of her primarily as an enemy. to them, and especially to Suwon, as you noted. I didn't remember that she had had any other type of relationship with them. I mean, even in the last chapter, Moiraine was thinking about her pranks, and one of them was like putting poison oak in Elida's clothes when they had to wash
Yes,
her clothes. That
yes,
that showed me that they were just thinking of Elida as one of their bullies. And later,
right,
that was my memory of the rest of New Spring too, how they think of her. Elida as their bully,
right.
and that comment about, oh, there's your pets really threw me off. I noticed that too. And I was like, what is her relationship to them? What is she going for? And I think you pointed out in the last episode a lot about how that's the way that the tower sees they need to shape and mold powerful people
Yes.
is by being extremely harsh. And I think it shows now that Elida was seeing that they had the potential to become really great Aes Sedai, and that her, from their perspective, bullying was aimed at doing that. But I never even thought of it as being a form of her trying to improve them. I completely forgot about this part of the
Right.
story.
And this is the only place I know in the entire series where you get this perspective.
Hmm.
And I believe, rightly so, um, from Moraine and Siouan's point of view, she was a bully.
Hmm.
She was probably too hard on them. From Aleda's point of view, she's being too hard because she wants to build greatness into them. I
Yeah.
I don't know that she completely achieved her goal of it, because I think in her mind greatness would have been being more like her,
Yeah.
perhaps even
And
joining the
probably
Red.
joining the Red. Yeah.
Right. Almost as you can think of a good coach will bring out the best in an athlete, a good teacher will bring out the best from a student's mind. I mean, the word educate literally means to bring from within.
Mm.
So as we see these things, I believe her effort was to build greatness into them. You see her as a spiteful, hateful person.
Yeah.
So I think you have this dichotomy between what she wants and what she actually does, and I believe
Yeah.
those are two different things. And then we get into the lighthearted, what I call lighthearted discussion about why would there be so many babies
Oh,
born at
yeah.
camp like this. And of course, the Aes Sedai explained that. But what I thought was so funny about it is Moraine's reaction to that. You know, there are things one knows and there are things one talks about. And her being so prim and proper in her upbringing, her cheeks just burn red with embarrassment that they're even talking about people procreating, having children.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a very good reason again why so many babies would be born. Just the uncertainty of war. People want to leave something behind. The man wants to leave something of himself behind. The woman wants to have something of him in case he doesn't comes back because of the uncertainty of war.
Hmm.
So we understand the human nature of that, and Moraine understood it, but just talking about it was just more than she could bear.
I know.
And,
She's like, oh my gosh, somebody mentioned sex. I have to
yes,
meditate now to calm down.
she literally had to go through the calming exercises. I am the river, the
Yeah.
flower, just to control her thoughts. And then we have this another just briefest touch upon the water bond. It's
Mm.
Malin and her warder, who's there, Andro, and it's almost like they could read minds. She knew he was getting impatient to go on. When Moraine is thinking about, wow, it's almost like she's reading his mind. I didn't think you could do that. And Madeline looks at her and says, no, I'm not reading his thoughts. So of course she's, even though it's forbidden to talk about this, it's a horrible taboo to talk about this. There are some things they say in here that traditions that are stronger than law. Malin appears to be one of the older Aes Sedai. And so she's had a lot of years to learn to read body language. And so just seeing Moraine's reaction, kind of seeing the gears turning behind her eyes, she was able to guess what Moraine was thinking. And I love the way of bringing that out. To me, it brought a little more lightheartedness into the story. At the same time, though, showing us an element of the bond between the Aes Sedai and their warders that's so important.
The girls are really curious about it here. Like Suwon in my chapter was thinking, oh, when I bond a warder, he's going to mind me better than Stellar is right now. And
Yes,
then
yes,
Maureen was like, oh, you thinking about bonding this grizzled old man? And
yeah,
Suwon gets really embarrassed. But there, you can tell you're not, because they're not allowed to talk much about it, as you mentioned. The girls are just so curious about what that bond is really like. They can sort of guess about it, but they don't know the details.
Right. In fact, they can't learn any of the weaves or any part of that weave until they are full Aes Sedai.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know the origins of the water bond, but we do know it's after the Sundering. Here, the Forsaken, they were unfamiliar with this. This is something they'd never seen. It's something that was designed, developed, created after they had been sealed away.
Yeah.
So it's kind of amazing. We see glimpses of this glorious past, both in architecture and in things done with the one power that can no longer be done, the things that have been lost, and we're always drawn to that, things that are lost to us in history that we know it's there, but we don't know the details of it. We don't know how it was done. So we see that in this world, and yet at the same time we see them develop new and amazing things that had never been thought of before.
Yeah.
And I don't recall it ever giving the origin of the water bond, but
No.
it is something unique and helpful, and of course, as we see, it can be used many different ways, but it is, I think, something important to this story. The knowledge being so forbidden to the accepted, of course, draws them to it. They want to know more about it. That's human nature. You pull away from that which rushes to you, and you tend to follow after that which pulls away. And so this knowledge being forbidden, they're naturally very curious about it and want to know more about it. Once they're back at the White Tower, you see the human heart, the love that Moiraine and Sioan have for one another. It's friends.
Yeah.
It never really takes us beyond that, but just for Moiraine to get up in the middle of the night and just walk to Sioan's room and just slip under the covers and the two of them lay there and talk. These are again the closest friends either one of them have ever had. They are like sisters to one another, and to see the distance that grows between them later on in the series is sad, even though they still remain friends and they have that same focused mission. But they are the closest of friends who become two strangers still bent on the same mission. And that's both sad and very realistic, because we all have, as we change through life, we have people who are very close to us that we kind of leave them behind, or they leave us behind, or life changes. And you can never recapture that closeness again. And in this book is one of the last times you see that much closeness between the two. Also, before Moiraine went to sleep in her own room, a bit earlier, she used a ward to protect her dreams from getting out. I thought this was interesting. Because she talked about how sometimes you'll find yourself in someone else's dream. I wonder if this just goes to the fact that some of the Aes Sedai have stepped into Tel'aran'rhiod unknowingly, and they thought they're just dreaming each other's dreams when actually they're both stepping into this world, and this one that, because so much lore has been lost, they know nothing about.
I wondered about that too, and I forgot. I didn't make a note about it, but that's sort of my belief too, is that maybe people are playing around with Tel'aran'rhiod unknowingly. Because if this were in the Eye of the World, for example, I would think, oh, well, Robert Jordan didn't have the entire magic system mapped out yet, and some things won't quite make sense. There's a couple of things in the Eye of the World, these Eye of the Worldisms that don't show up again, that don't quite make sense of what we know of the magic. But the fact that this is 10 or 11 books into his writing, that was very intentional. It had to be at this point.
I felt like it.
Yeah, so, and we do know that in Eye of the World, she talked about dreams and being able to ward them. That's one of the first things she ever says to Rand, like, hey, tell me if you have bad dreams. And of course he doesn't. But I don't remember knowing before this. Maybe I haven't been careful enough my first time through, and in my reread, I'll pick this up in the rest of the series, but I did not remember that their dreams could just kind of leak out like that in the White Tower. That's fascinating.
And it may be nothing more than just dreams, and the fact that channeling makes you more susceptible to them. But I feel like it's something deeper than that. And he's just giving us a hint of it, shown from the perspective of two young girls who don't know about it, even though it's a very real thing. And then, like I said, it has this conversation in closing between Sioan and Moiraine as they're talking about basically what it's going to be like. They're dreaming about the Dragon Reborn and finding him, what's going to happen. And there were just a few quotes I have from this. And as he closed out this chapter, I'll close out my part of this discussion with these quotes that I thought were thought-provoking. This is their perception of what it needed to be like to prepare the dragon reborn. It says they can bring him to the tower. And I'm not going to give you which one said which, but they're just talking back and forth here. He can be protected here, which of course we know is very wrong. He could not be protected there, but in their minds he could be. And educated. And then in her thoughts, without saying it, she says, he would need to know as much of politics as any queen, as much of war as any general, as much of history as any scholar. And then again, out loud, the terms, he can be guided, and I had to underline that one. He can be guided. That was their thoughts. As we learn, the dragon reborn cannot really be guided anywhere he doesn't want to be.
No.
He is someone who knew as much of politics as any queen, as much of war as any general, as much of history as any scholar, but only because of Luz Theron Tealaman in his head, giving him this information, guiding him, preparing him in ways the White Tower couldn't.
Whoa.
And then the last quote from this chapter, the tower can't teach him to channel, Moiraine. I thought that was interesting. It all comes, all the things they can do and all the things they must do to prepare him for Tarmangaden and the end of the world and the end of times. They cannot teach him to channel. They don't even begin to know where to start. So
he has to pick that up on his own by having Asmodean as a pet. I know you have to go soon, but I have one more thing about that quote that you pulled. You said that he would need to know as much about politics as any queen. One of his eventual 3 wives is the queen of Andor, Elaine. As much of battle as any general. He has Aviendha for that. But also you could look at his friends. He's got Mat, the general who has all this knowledge, as much of history as any scholar. Also, he has Mat for that. But you could see Min as that way too, because she gets obsessed with studying the prophecies and everything later on. So you can see Mat in there for some reason, and his 3 wives represented in this quote.
I never saw that tie-in. That is beautiful.
I only just thought of that.
Yes, it's amazing that this one quote is in a way very prophetic, but fulfilled in ways that these girls never thought of.
Yeah.
And that was just a thought. It was not said out loud, but just that thought that went through her mind that is, to me, it made me want to step in there and tell her, girl, if you only knew
I know
what you're gonna say, especially if you try to guide this young man.
Oof.
But in their minds, in the idealism of youth, that's what had to happen. And as you pointed out, in more than one way, yes, it happened, but absolutely not in the way she saw. And that is an apt description of life. Life is the things that happen when you don't expect it, and they come at you sideways when you plan one thing and it takes you in a completely different direction. But if you stop and look at it, it's very beautiful.
I love that. Thank you so much for really closing out the discussion that way.
Anyway, I know this was so full of spoilers, and we warned everyone ahead of time, but I hope people listening to this podcast have already read the entire series, familiar with it, and this is just, as we do, a way of looking back, enjoying, catching those details. It's a fascinating read to go through the character studies like we're doing. Fascinating for me. I hope it is to all of our listeners out there. And I am enjoying it. You're enjoying it as thoroughly as I am, LaChara.
Yes. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you, dear listener. If you have any questions, thoughts, or feedback about this episode, or you just want to help me roast Forsaken on Twitter, you can find me at LaJara Sedai. That's LaJara Sedai.